welcome back. I see you found your way to our new recording of 2025. You have now entered the Macabre Manor. Here you will get to experience tales of the mystifying, stories from horrific true crime cases throughout the ages, and historical mysteries and bizarre phenomena. My name is Carly, but most people call me Carl, and I will be your host today. Come and take a walk in the mind of the macabre. Today, I have a very handsome co-host with me. It is not Jacob, but in fact, Araan the Baron. Say hi to our Maccabees, Araan.
Hello, Maccabees, and welcome back for our first new episode of 2025.
So this week we're switching it up, how we do our episodes to bring better content for you guys for the future. I just want to let you guys all know, Jacob will no longer be recording with me as of right now. He went to one of those crazy islands that have like no outside connections to the world and like might be cannibals, and he went to go teach them about books, and he's possibly dead. So he's not coming back for a while. So this podcast is gonna be me and surprise co-host, and then like also just me sometimes. So in the past, we've done sort of surprise episodes. Myself or Jacob would have chosen a subject without the other one having any idea what we were going to be talking about. And the other one would sit and listen. So the episodes were always new to both the listeners and the co-hosts that wasn't telling the tale. This year, we're starting it over. We're going to do, our episodes will be spoken about and written by myself, Carl, and I will have different co-hosts and sometimes just me to bring bigger perspectives, newer topics, and way more in-depth stories. It's going to be great. I want to go ahead and tell you guys at this point that macabre podcasts may not be suitable for all audiences. Please be aware of that as you decide how and when to listen to our episodes, as listener discretion is advised. So maybe not in the car with your kiddos. So, with that, we dive into like one of history's most terrifying and transformative events. This is episode 16, The Many Masks of the Bubonic Plague. Imagine a world gripped by fear, where entire villages vanished overnight, and the very fabric of society was torn apart by an invisible killer. Bodies piling up on the street corners where the local market used to sell goods. The air thick and heavy with the stench of death. It seemed no place was safe for anyone. Something is spreading like wildfire through the people, striking them down with an unbeatable illness that steals their lives like a thief in the night. This deadly disease, carried by the fleas on rats, swept through Europe in the 14th century with catastrophic speeds, changing the course of history in ways we're still feeling today. From the rise of medieval science to the profound shifts in culture and economy, the plague didn't just ravage populations. It reshaped the very essence of life. So settle in as we explore the mystery, horror, and legacy of
The Black Plague.
Woo!
What a time to be alive.
Now is the time to be alive. Not this time. Not the Black Plague.
All right, so it's known as the deadliest pandemic in human history. It was believed to have started around Central Asia, sweeping across the borders of modern-day Mongolia and China around the mid-1300s. The plague was caused by a bacterium known as Yersinia pestis, which was spread from fleas that lived on the bodies of rats. These fleas would bite infected animals and humans, transferring the disease. Transporting of the disease was spread through the good old Silk Road, which connected Asia, and this time to Europe. The movement of people, goods, and even armies facilitated the rapid and vast spread of the disease.
Yuck. That sounds awful. When was the first outbreak noted? I'm kind of wondering if something could be spread so quickly and so widely. When were the first signs of the plague destruction even noted?
So the first major outbreaks were reported in the Mongol Empire in the year 1331. There were signs in China and then noticeable spread through the West. By 1346, the plague reached Crimea, a region that was part of the Mongol Empire. Through trade ships and military campaigning, from there it spread further into Europe via the Mediterranean ports.
The arrival of the plague into Europe was in 1347 when a group of Genoese traders brought it from the Crimean port of Kaffa, now Feodosia in Ukraine, to the Italian port of Messina. Please excuse any mispronunciations from us. We're just trying our best. The disease spread rapidly through the coast of Italy and across every corner of Europe, hitting its hardest in busy ports and cities. This plague was like a dark, unstoppable storm just sweeping over every corner, reshaping society as they knew it in ways no one could have imagined. In just a few short years, it cut down nearly a third of the population. Do you have any idea, hun, how much a third of the population might be? Like, take a guess how many people you might think that is.
500,000.
Wrong as usual. It is 25
I have
to...
no idea.
It is 25 to 30 million people. That's a lot of people.
Too many.
Yes, I agree. It's too many people to die. Leaving behind empty villages and ghostly cities. The fabric of medieval life was torn apart as families, communities, and entire towns were wiped from history. The once booming trade routes became death traps as merchants and travelers unknowingly spread the disease further. But beyond the physical toll, the plague shattered Europe's sense of security and divine order, igniting a crisis in faith as people questioned their beliefs, with some turning to extreme religious fervor and others embracing a new cynical view on the world.
The absence of so many workers sparked economic shifts, leading the rise of labor shortages and the eventual breakdown of feudalism.
Feudalism? What is that?
Feudalism is basically the medieval version of I scratch your back, you scratch mine, but with a lot of cool castles, knights, and peasants who couldn't catch a break. Imagine you're living in the Middle Ages.
Well, that's kind of my dream. Okay, so I'm living in the Middle Ages. I'm a king in the Knight's Guard. Continue.
Really?
Yes.
Okay, so instead of a paycheck, your boss, the king, hands you a huge chunk of land. You don't get to keep it, though. You have to give him a bunch of food and support all of his wars, which happen all the time.
That's not really off to a great start here, but continue.
In return, you get to live in your cozy little manor on your land because you're a vassal to the king, which sounds fancy, but it means you're his personal tenant. But wait, there's more.
More?
Oh, yes. Yes, my dear, there is more. You don't have total freedom even after meeting all the king's demands. The king also has loyal knights who want their shares of the land. So they end up giving you land in exchange for their loyalty, which sounds good, except now you're not just a lord. You're a landlord, and you have to manage a bunch of peasants.
Okay, and tell me more about these peasants.
The peasants, well, they're busy working the land and giving you a share of whatever they grow, but spoiler alert, they don't get paid. They're like the unpaid interns of the Middle Ages, except they aren't allowed to quit, and they're stuck there for life.
So what you're telling me is, in short, feudalism is like a never-ending game of Monopoly where rich landowners are winning, everyone's stuck paying rent, hoping for a chance at a new farm, but it never actually getting anything in return. And the Bubonic Plague was a key factor in destroying that disgusting way of life. Amazing, but in the worst way. With fewer peasants and workers, some of the rigid social hierarchies began to crumble. This is the shift that contributed to the rise of more urban and market-based economies in the area.
Exactly.
So what is the plague? What did these people really go through? Imagine you wake up feeling like you've been hit by a truck. Super tired, feverish, and with body aches all over. But then, hours later, something even worse is happening. You get these really painful, swollen lumps in your groin, armpits, and neck. These lumps are called buboes, and they're like giant, painful, hard marbles under your skin. You might even see them turning black and blue, which is where they get the term bubonic. And if that isn't enough, your fever spikes to crazy high levels. You would likely experience the chills and feel very nauseous, possibly even vomiting. And if Aaron and I know anything about high fevers, you're hallucinating too. Because our son a few years ago got the flu and his fever was so high, he was hallucinating that he was on like Cake Masters in his bedroom.
Remember he came in and asked us to stop making cakes?
No, we walked into his room to tell him goodnight, and he looked like through us, like with glassy eyes, and was like talking like, you can't make the cakes in my bedroom anymore. And I looked at Aaron and I was like, we're taking him to the hospital. So that's what these people are doing, except I imagine they're hallucinating like Mrs. Lovett's meat pies over like on Fleet Street.
People pies?
People pies. Rat pies.
Ew.
Well, it's the plague. There's lots of rats. Obviously, it's killing everyone. So yeah, if that wasn't enough, you get this high fever and your body is basically telling you, help, I'm in distress, because the bacteria is spreading and it's messing with your entire system. In some cases, you could also develop septicemia, which is like an infection spilling into your bloodstream, or even pneumonia, which makes it even more dangerous since it can now be spread through the air. Basically, it's a lot like your body throwing a huge, dramatic, unwelcome tantrum with extreme pain and a bunch of bad side effects. The good news, it's treatable today with antibiotics. But back in the day, it was pretty much fatal. So the bad news is for the people who actually experienced this. Poor guys.
Indeed. The survival time after contracting the bubonic plague varied depending on many factors, like the strain they got, the person's overall health, and how quickly they received treatment, if they did at all. Without modern antibiotics, most people who got the plague did not survive long. If a person caught what was called the bubonic form, the symptoms would start suddenly, often within a few days of exposure. The swelling in the lymph nodes, or buboes, would become painful, and if untreated, the infection could spread quickly. Most people who didn't get treated with antibiotics would die within 3 to 7 days from infection. In the case of septicemic plague, which is when the infection spreads to the bloodstream, death would be within a matter of hours. And if you contracted the pneumonic plague, infection in the lungs, it would be fatal in 1 to 3 days, especially since it could be transmitted through the air, making it even more contagious.
Hey, honey, did you know that more women own cats than men in this time period?
Not only did I not know that, but that doesn't have anything to do with what we're talking about.
Well, actually it does. This simply meant, and I'm right all the time, honey.
Of course.
Of course. I wouldn't bring it up if it didn't matter, right?
That's right.
This simply meant that women got the plague less than their male counterparts because the cats would catch and kill mice before they entered homes and shops where the women were with their little feline friends. So less rats, less fleas. Women were living more than their male counterparts.
Well, that might be all fine and dandy for the witches, but
Witches!
For the rest of the population, the death toll was exacting its revenge on society. With the death toll you mentioned earlier hitting 25 to 30 million, the feudal system wasn't the only thing wiped out. With so many dead people, a severe labor shortage ensued. Farms and fields left desolate, leading to crop failures and food shortage and inflation. Those who survived could demand higher wages on the social structure, which relied heavily on peasants and serfs, was deeply disrupted. In some cases, peasants gained more bargaining power because there were fewer of them, and they could finally negotiate better terms with their landowners.
The economy was severely affected as trade routes became less active, and cities suffered from a decline in both population and economic activity. Craft industries and markets also really felt the impact due to the loss of workers and customers. This made things more difficult for the survivors, as well as wealth and resources became even more concentrated and in fewer hands. But what did this do for the physiological and social impact? Actually, I meant psychological. I'm just a silly goose. I'm sorry. What did this all do for the psychological and social impact? All these changes surely had to cause a greater impact on the nations than just the money and the crops, right?
Yeah, it did. As you can imagine, the Middle Ages were riddled with all kinds of superstitions and fears to begin with. But the mass demolition of souls caused by the Black Plague caused even more widespread distress to the masses. People turned to religion for answers, since they didn't have Google or Ask Jeeves.
Ask Jeeves.
Engaging in things like extreme behaviors such as self-flagellation to atone for their perceived sins, some believe the plague was a form of divine punishment. The death tolls lead to a complete collapse of the social order, with the rich fleeing to the countryside with their priceless artwork and golden spoons, and the church and local leaders struggling to provide guidance and support to the impoverished. The culture of the affected became pessimistically macabre. Artists and writers began to focus more wholly on the themes of death and the transient nature of life as they knew and experienced in its greatness and sadness.
This devastating impact on the world led to shifts in the way people view and study medicine and disease today. Although medical knowledge was very limited, the catastrophic loss of life made greater efforts to understand and even combat and prevent disease for the first time. In the long term, this contributed to changes in public health practice and eventually the development of important medical techniques. And what do you want? Oh, honey, what is that thing you always want to dress up as for the Renaissance Fair? Like every year.
Oh, the plague doctor?
Yeah.
The mysterious figures that stalked the streets during the Black Death?
Mm-hmm.
If you've ever seen a painting of a medieval doctor wearing a bird-like mask with glass eye holes and a long, flowing dark coat, you've likely encountered this iconic character. But did you know that these so-called doctors weren't really curing the plague at all? No. They were more like the equivalent of a medieval manager trying their best with very few tools and a lot of unqualified enthusiasm.
Let's set the scene. It's the 14th century. Europe is hanging on by a thread at the mercy of the Black Death. Naturally, it was someone's job to step in and try to help, right?
And who better than the plague? Who better than the doctors in the bird masks?
The plague doctors.
The bizarre and handsome look of the plague doctor wasn't just for flair. It did actually have a functional purpose. The long, sleek beak of the mask was filled. The long, sleek beak of the mask was filled with aromatic herbs and spices.
That secret blend of herbs and spices. Yes, because the prevailing theory at the time was that the bad air, or miasma, was the culprit of the plague and its afflictions. So along they went, stuffing their beaks to keep out the noxious vapors, and subsequently, the death of the plague. Common herbs that they used were lavender, cloves, and even myrrh. Murder.
Kind of like wearing a scented candle on your face.
Into battle?
In the battle.
Yeah. A very fashionista way to wear your perfume into the battlegrounds of the plague, wasn't it?
Now, Carl, these were just accessories for the fine fumigators. Aside from strolling around the streets looking like they had just stepped out of a gothic horror film or the rest of the demon barber on Fleet Street, they did very little in terms of medical treatment. Their job was more of just studying and observing the sick, documenting symptoms, and occasionally bloodletting and giving herbal remedy. Could you imagine that?
How nice of them.
I don't know anything. I'm just going to take some blood from you.
That's actually really common in like older medicine throughout history. It's like, we don't really know what's wrong with you. Let's drain your blood. I'm dead serious. I'm going to cover a case about that. And that is like one of the things.
The
actually,
go-to thing to do.
Yeah, I actually covered the real Dr. Jekyll and Mr. Hyde. And he was in Kansas City, Missouri. And he was like, you know what I'm going to do? Let's take more blood. Let's just drain it.
Of course. So in many ways, they were the medieval version of, we're not really sure what's going on here, but let's try this anyways. Their main role was to just write down the number of dead people and track the spread of disease. Glorified plague recorders with a penchant for aromatherapy, if you will.
I will. Wow. So they're really just like nosy Normans inserting themselves into the line of fire of the pandemic just for a little info.
Exactly. And if you're wondering why these silly perfumed buffoons became such an iconic image in history, it's because despite their best efforts to cure the plague with their little crow masks, and it ended up being the symbol of both the medieval panic and the limitations of medical science. They were in essence early pioneers in the fight against disease. But let's face it, their methods were more medieval fashion statements than medical breakthrough. So they didn't actually help the masses.
They were the medieval CDC, but not really, because I think the CDC actually studies illnesses and tries to fix them. Okay. People didn't actually even realize it was the fleas on rats causing the bubonic plague until the late 19th century, long after the plague had already decimated entire populations of Europe and Asia. In fact, for centuries, the idea that the plague was transmitted by fleas was completely off the radar, with medieval folks blaming things like divine punishment and bad air instead. It wasn't until 1894 when a French bacteriologist named Alexandre Yersin, sound familiar? Made the key discovery during the plague outbreak in Hong Kong. Yersin identified the bacterium, known as Yersinia pestis, as the cause of the bubonic plague. He didn't just figure out what it was, but also how it spread by the fleas that lived on the rats. And when the fleas bit the human, they got the disease. While rats played the biggest role in the host for the fleas, it was actually the fleas that were solely the hosts of the disease. When a flea bit the infected rat, the bacteria would multiply in the flea's gut, blocking it up. And then when the flea would bite a human, it would regurgitate the infected material back into the human's bloodstream, passing on the plague bacteria. It turns out that rats were unwitting carriers, and the fleas were the real villains of this entire deadly drama.
But a few years after the plague dropped its destruction onto the people of the world, something changes. It doesn't happen overnight, though. You see, the plague had to wear itself out, piece by piece.
We talked about the deaths, but let's talk for a minute about the survivors. The death toll was catastrophic, and even so, something interesting happened among the lucky few who managed to avoid the Grim Reaper's reckoning. They lived, and some experts believe that many of these survivors developed a sort of immunity to the disease. In other words, the population slowly started to build a shield. Though it wasn't in a conscious effort or due to the nice-smelling beaks of the plague doctors, life will out. Those who survived passed on their resilience to their children, and little by little the disease struggled to even find a next victim.
And there were more factors at play. As cities were getting hit hard, the people started to wisen up and realize the plague wasn't just spread through bad luck. So cities began setting up their first quarantine systems. Imagine a town with a huge wall of people trying to leave, only to be stopped at the gates, forced to stay for weeks to prove they weren't carriers of the plague. Some areas of the quarantine were very harsh, but they worked. Trade routes were disrupted. Think about how that forced the disease to slow down. It had fewer people to infect and fewer places to go.
And then there was nature itself that plays its own hand. You see, the rats and fleas were the plague's greatest allies. They preferred the warm weather. As seasons changed and colder temperatures reared their head, the fleas slowed down, resulting in the disease spreading less easily. Plague outbreaks always dwindled in winter, only to come back when the season warmed up again. Strangely enough, eventually, come spring, the outbreaks weren't really as deadly. People became a little more prepared, and the cycle of death began to shorten.
And another surprising twist came from the rats themselves. Over time, it's believed the rat population in Europe started to change. As cities were rebuilding and more hygienic practices were adopted, think cleaner streets, better waste disposal and management, the rats started to disappear in some places. As the rats shrank in population, so did the fleas. Fewer rats, fewer fleas, fewer chances of the plague spreading.
And perhaps the most unexpected change of all, the bacteria itself started to evolve. Good old Yersinia pestis mutated over time, growing significantly less deadly. Diseases do evolve, after all, and while the plague wasn't completely gone, it did mean it was less deadly, and that's a huge difference to the infected. Imagine the power of nature itself working with time to wear down a once unstoppable force.
But let's not sugarcoat it, Carl. The plague didn't just vanish. No, even after the Black Plague's worst days were over, Europe still saw smaller outbreaks for centuries into the 17th century. But it wasn't the same by that point. By then, societies were more aware, more hygienic, and people's health was improving. People had finally begun to feel like they found ways to control and contain disease a lot better.
So how did it end? Well, it wasn't a single click of fate. It was a slow, gradual process like the making of the Grand Canyon. It was a combination of immunity, better hygiene, quarantines, and a bit of au naturel evolution. The Black Death may have shaped the course of history, but the beast was tamed, and the world moved forward, scarred, but much wiser.
And that concludes our first episode of 2025, episode 16, The Many Masks of the Bubonic Plague. Thank you so much for tuning in and being our loyal listeners. Join us next Monday as we uncover for more of the macabre.
Macabre Mondays! I was just looking up on my phone because I wanted to tell you really quick before we end the episode. I do have this story of a woman who, they did have many cats. This is relevant. Her name is Elizabeth Hancock. She lived with her husband and 6 children out on a farm. I believe they were, I don't know if they were in Great Britain or Scotland. Oh, they were in Ayam, England during the Black Death. She buried her entire family of 7 by herself, and her actions are now known as like heroic acts of self-sacrifice. Then she quarantined herself. And then after the plague, she moved to Sheffield to live out her remaining life with the one son that lived. So she buried like 7 of her family members, her husband, 6 of her kids, and then went to live out in a nearby village with her son and herself, and actually survived the plague. I just think that's crazy.
Sounds like she's pretty familiar with how a shovel works.
Well, she'd have to be.
7 different graves. That's a lot of digging.
Yeah. So, yes. And remember, if you can, please send us feedback from our episodes. It's so tremendously helpful if you're listening on Spotify or Apple Music or even Amazon Music or even watching us on YouTube. Just putting that little 5-star review helps us so much. It takes about 2 seconds to scroll up and do that. And we'd also love to hear any feedback from you, or if you have episode recommendations. We've got a list of some really good ones from friends and family that we're going to kind of go through, but I absolutely would love to hear from other people, like other things you really want to hear us talk about. Chat with us on our socials at Macabre Mondays. And until then, stay curious and stay weird, Maccabees. We're signing out.
Signing out.
Yep.